Hi, and welcome to this fifth tutorial in the What IO series about Digital Product Passport. Now we're going to go quite technical, and also because of the length of the API and the part 5, I actually divided this into two parts. The first part is more generic about what is an API, going through generic things, and then more into detail about the What.io REST API itself. It's the part 2. So we actually made it in, two parts. So let's get started with part 1. And of course, before we start to dig into the What.io API in part 2, we need to explain what is an API. If you know already everything about APIs, skip part 1, go straight to part 2, where it's more tailored into the What.io specific REST API. So if you don't know, you need to know the basics. An API, it means application programming interface. It's a set of rules and protocols that allows two software systems to communicate and interact with each other. It basically defines the methods and data structures for us developers to interact with software components, and it can be used by web services, operative systems, applications, etc. And obviously in the Surpass 2 project for DPPs, this is extremely important. This is basically where we have to use the correct semantics and ontology so computers can speak to other computers. So APIs basically allow applications to share data in a standardized way. So very much of the work we do in Surpass 2. It's much easier for us developers to build very complex systems because we can leverage pre-existing function services or data sources. It means that everybody doesn't need to invent the wheel by themselves. You can integrate solutions from others and take advantage of other people's functionality. So one example would be that let's say you use an app on your smartphone to check the weather. That app actually itself doesn't have a weather system in itself. It basically uses an API, go and ask a weather service what is the weather in that location, and that app sends a request to the API. The API sends back the data, and the app displays it to you. Very simple. So why is API important, and why are we having a lot of focus on that in What.io? Many reasons, obviously. Integration is one. It really allows different software systems to integrate with each other and work together. And an example is you connect your mobile app to database, cloud service, or third-party server using apps. As an example, our burning apps are apps where we program the NFC tags is already using our own API. So we use our API even for our own development, for our own technology, because that app is then communicating with the What.io database and asks it to generate the token, and it checks what team you're involved in and what data you're allowed to view and these kind of things. So it's extremely important. Efficiency, of course, it enables developers to leverage pre-built functionality, so you don't need to build everything from scratch. So, for instance, if you want to use our material database, it's there, accessible in the API. You don't need to develop everything yourself. The other way around, if you already have a material database, you can actually export that or use that in our solution, because the API can then manage the synchronization between the two. Scalability is another reason. APIs are designed to handle requests from many clients at once, so services can really scale across multiple platforms or applications. Security is another issue. By using APIs, we can share data without exposing internal details of their operation. We can access restricted areas with authentication authorization, and basically add another layer of security by using the security in the APIs. Then finally, automation, repetitive tasks that really enable communication between systems without any human intervention. It's just automated in the background and servicing you as a user. So how does it really work? Yeah. So typically, most APIs are request response systems over the internet. They follow a client-server architecture. So the client, it can be your application or your device. It can send a request to the server, which is the API, and the server processes the request and sends back a response. This communication usually happens via standard HTTPS protocols in web APIs. And here's a very simple example of a API request and response. So we would like to know the weather in Miami. So what we do is we send a request to an API endpoint. And it can look like this: get v1 weather city equals Miami. That is sent to fetch the weather data for a specific city. The server responds back very often in a JSON structured object file with the current temperature, humidity, and so on. And then we can, of course, use this in our app to display the weather, either if it's on a smartwatch or in another system. So it's a kind of a request and response system over the web. There is, of course, many different types of APIs. We have web APIs. They are typically what I already explained with the weather app. This example include RESTful APIs and so on. And actually, that is basically what we have today at Word.io at this moment of time. There can be library-based APIs, software libraries or frameworks allowing developers to perform specific functions like image manipulation and data processing. We use that ourselves in our development to speed up our own work. And there can be hardware APIs, so you can actually use it for communicating with printers, cameras, or actually microcontrollers, like the Arduino environment we actually have and work with. The common API terminology, which you will actually see later in part 2, is good to know. So endpoint means the URL where the API service is accessed. And each endpoint is a unique location where an API call is made. Basically, that's the address where you send it. A request is a call made by the client to the API. And usually it contains a method like get, post, put, delete, and some additional parameters. Then when you send a request, you get a response. That's the data sent back to the server after processing the client's request. That response usually contains the requested data or status code or anything similar to that. There can be a rate limit. That could be a restriction placed how many requests you're allowed to send within a given time frame. And that is, of course, to avoid spamming and hacking and all these kind of things. And then there is something very important, and that's the unique identifier, the API key. It's used to authenticate who you are and that you are actually allowed to do these requests. It's more or less like a unique identifier, including a password for you accessing the API. So when we go into chapter 2, it's important that you have a good understanding of what is a REST API, what is an API as a whole, and also these kind of terminologies. It will make it easier when we go into part number 2. So that basically ends the generic section of APIs. And yeah, head over to part 2 and get ready for a little bit longer chapter, but that will go into details about the What.io